E aí, amigos do DRicast, estamos voltando agora em 2019 num novo modelo, com uma surpresa especial para vocês, começando o nosso canal do YouTube. Eu aqui, Isabella, vocês finalmente estão vendo o rosto por detrás do som, do áudio. E nesse episódio especial a gente vai estar aqui com a doutora Phoebe, ela que é especialista em Gênero, Cultura, Sexualidades. Estaremos entrevistando ela em inglês e vocês vão ter a honra de estar o vídeo legendado. Então vamos começar a entrevista. Hi Phoebe, how are you doing today?
I'm good. A bit tired but good.
Yeah, I also. Can you talk a little about you? Like, what you did, where you come from?
Okay. That's always a difficult question for me, having been a nomadic subject most of my entire life. Usually people ask me, I live in Cape Town, which is a very touristy city, and every now and then I have friends who come visit me and I take them to tourist places. And so the first question they ask is, where are you from? And I'm like, I don't know. And so I always say I'm from the continent, but I've lived in many different places. But I came in from Cape Town, from here, which is my home for the moment, and hopefully for the next 3 years. It's one of my favorite cities in the world that I've lived in. You have the mountain, it's very scenic. You have the ocean, and you have the wine, and you have the seafood. What more can you ask for? So I've lived in many different places. I'm a nomadic subject, but what particularly took me to Cape Town perhaps is to work as a research affiliate with the African Gender Institute at the University of Cape Town. And there I'm working on a really amazing project that engages with decolonial methods of research to engage with marginal communities. And the community we're working with in particular for this project is sex work. And we're engaging with art as a means of research, as a research tool, which is quite uncommon, but firmly situated within decoloniality and decolonial approaches to engaging with lived experiences. And the methodology we're working with is performative theatre, where we'll work with a group of 10 sex workers who will be co-researchers or are co-researchers of the project, with the end result of them establishing an independent sex workers theatre, and they can perform anywhere in the world. So beware, they could end up here and can know us in 3 years for all you know. But that's where it's headed. And I ended up in Cape Town because, or South Africa, particularly because of the political climate. There's a political climate going on at the universities. I don't know if you heard or not or followed the student protests in 2015, which were really engaging with the idea of what a university is and who is the university made for and which bodies are left out of university spaces. So they really questioned and dismantled and decentered the idea of knowledge and where knowledge historically comes from and how other knowledges are excluded, and also how these universities are deeply embedded within neoliberal and capitalist models that mean that those on the margins can't access them. Who's on the margin? It's people of color, given the historical context South Africa is that, it was colonized for 400 years, and then after that it was apartheid for 50 years. So who ends up in the margins is people of color, and it's people of color.
So it's like Brazil in that sense.
Yes, indeed. Lots of similarities. So that's why I was quite excited to come here, because there are indeed similarities and parallels we can draw and contextually. So when Fabi and Tachi speak, I can relate, to some of the socio-political dynamics they raise.
So, what made you choose to research, to study gender, culture, and sexuality?
Okay.
What brought you to these areas?
Oh, really? Well, that's a really broad question. I don't know where. Perhaps I'll go ontological on it.
Yeah.
Where I started off in psychology, and of course you address aspects of it, but only marginally, really. And my first job, once I completed my undergrad, it was within the epicenter it was within the period where HIV was, it's still a big deal, but it was a massive big deal. And I don't know, I've always been socially conscious and aware of how the world is structured with so many inequalities, and for me, this is my bit of adding to the pool of those working within the realm of social justice. So I guess that's why I was pulled towards the field of HIV, and then but it was very much lacking in recognition of gender. Yet the burden of HIV fell on women, but they were hardly interrogated or incorporated or addressed in their diversity, as opposed to just focusing on biological and maybe a bit of socio-economic aspects. And I think that's what motivated me to end up into gender. So that was one of the drivers. So I ended up specializing in gender and women of gender and culture and sexuality.
Cool. Now we're gonna start talking about a little about your thesis. From our listeners who don't know, Phoebe thesis is about decolonizing sexualities, the lived experience of Black township women who love women. You can talk about how did the research, how.
Okay.
Like a little bit of everything.
Okay. Again, how I ended up on that topic is this little ontological journey I just gave you when I was in HIV. And again, there were lots of people completely ignored, or, that's how development works, where interventions are very much time focused. So, every now and then they realize, oops, this population has been forgotten, and then resources are poured into that, and then another population is forgotten, oops, and then resources are poured. So I noticed a huge gap. So then when I worked within HIV, if you understand or familiar or have heard of the development discourse in relation to public health, you would have heard of the labeling called men who have sex with men. And this is a behavior marker as opposed to an identity to incorporate or encompass those in same-sex relationships that do not identify per se as homosexual or gay, but engage in same-sex relations for all manner of reasons, including sexual pleasure, which is central. So when I worked within the field of HIV, there was attempts to focus on that, although on the continent, given the sort of homophobic terrain, which has a historical contextualization, which I might or might not get into because it's really long. So there were there were attempts to engage, and that exponentially grew with finances being poured into interventions related to men who have sex with men. But women, again, were left out on the side. Why? Because apparently female same-to-sex is not perceived as sex per se, because it's not sex with a penis, and so, biologically
once again,
at risk. Left behind. Yes, indeed. So that drove me in a way. So it left me puzzled, and I'm like, why? But why? I mean, there are other means that transference can happen, and indeed, in one particular study that and again, no resources again to explore this so-called myth, but in a study in Texas, one particular study where a bit of money by the CDC, Center for Disease Control, poured a bit of money to really do an epidemiological study on two exclusively lesbian couples, found actually a transmission of HIV from one to another. So indeed, it may be rare, but can't be completely excluded, and women in same-sex relationships can't be excluded from, sexual health interventions, which is this, one of the dimensions within this narrative. So that's what got me thinking, into that. But then, of course, when I got into my PhD and having entered the gender route, then the idea of how these identities are constructed came about. So that's how I interrogated it. And having did my undergrad in South Africa and studied there, and I did my PhD in the Netherlands, by the way. And there's a historical connection between the Netherlands and South Africa, colonial historical connections. So the tendency to do collaboratory projects is quite common in that regard. So I got funding and was able to complete this doctoral research, which was empirical. So I spent about 10 months in South Africa collecting data, and I worked with really a great big group of black township lesbians. So townships are like favelas here, who again, their narrative has predominantly been on hate crimes and violence as opposed to who they are as people. So I wanted to counter that as well and offer a more a nuanced understanding of who they are. And it's through that I really got to interrogate what identities is, what Africanness is, and what sexuality is. And of course, that brings in the decolonial aspect, where decolonial scholars note how these identity categories are not ontological per se, but are fictitious categories that came about, of course, the onslaught of colonialism and slavery, and how that came to be imposed in these contexts where they had their own gendered arrangements and sexual arrangements, which were not necessarily per se in alignment with the West or the former colonizers, but got suppressed and or pushed to the margins, and those dominant ones of the civilized came to be known as what was true. So in a sense, we don't know, because some of these expressions have been lost with colonialism, and there are those who are doing historical archiving to engage with what was before, but it's not easy to reclaim that, given knowledge production or transference of knowledge was through storytelling, ideas that have been lost. But of course there's aspects like Bushman paintings and other historical dimensions that could be read into, that people are really getting into, whereas that whatever is written has been through the colonial gaze, so of course it's loaded with the colonial gaze in terms of interpretation. But there are some who are doing a rereading of that. One of them is Neverhood, who has done a really great reading of what sexuality, how the hetero homo-binary came to be imposed in Uganda, where I was born, with the last king in Buganda, who, with the last pre-colonial king, who his bodily acts of sex with men was labeled as homosexual, but of course that labeling went with objections, so it was seen as unnatural and unchristian, and all of which were morals that were steeped within a Victorian era that the colonizers or the metropole was practicing at that point in time. So these became infused into the local narrative. So my interrogation of decolonizing sexuality really traces this back to how these labelings came about and how certain dominant hegemonies came to be and others suppressed.
Did you have any difficulty on collecting data with those women? Were they comfortable and talking about their stories, or it was like, oh, okay, we're just gonna say some things to you and then please don't talk.
No, but that's the thing, that there's an interesting contradiction going on in South Africa, if you like. So South Africa was one of the first countries to integrate or include or incorporate the sexuality clause within their constitution. So this was with the end of apartheid. The legal frame was seen as one area where they would redress the ills of the past, because apartheid was deeply embedded in the legal frame of segregation. So to address that, there was a lot of, looking beyond just what could have been legislated elsewhere, but went far and beyond to address that from a legal point of view. So, and that was implemented in 1996, and with an onslaught of activism and, of course, NGOization of services, where sexuality services are firmly embedded within newly liberalized NGOs. There was a lot of human rights activism going on, and of course creation of spaces they call safe spaces, a model imported from America as a way of reaching women in same-sex relations in townships. And these young women, most of them were young women who were interviewed with my average age was about 20, so very young. They're given a name in South Africa, of course, which means nothing. Born free, as if you're born, because they were born after apartheid, so so that was seen as a mark of freedom. Of course, you can deconstruct that in so many ways. But the born free generation have embraced this element of freedom in that regard, and these NGOs, which were my gatekeepers and entrance to the communities, many of them were attached to them, and there was a strong sense of freedom and lack of being closeted, if you like. I was quite afraid, and tried to see how I can go far and beyond should I not find participants. But I was pleasantly surprised that there were lots of people who wanted to engage and communicate and to be interviewed. Because I guess I had a different ear from what other researchers had, that of wanting to look far and beyond certain narratives that had been created, that of only focusing on violence and hate crimes. And so in some of the focus groups, for instance, where I expected to sit with 5 or 6 people, there were 20 or 25 people, for instance. But then, of course, there were also other little incentives that went along with some of this research. So yes, there were lots of women who wanted to speak to me, and there's lots of visibility now. There's engaging with social media, so there are lots on social media and forming groups, and that becomes a space as well where there's an element of expression and safety and just being. But indeed, hate crimes are real, and homophobia is real. These women experience it on a daily basis. In fact, I term it in my dissertation everyday heterosexism, where during my data collection time, 3 lesbians were killed, murdered.
Wow.
Yes. Their lived experiences in terms of facing homophobia and hate crimes is real. But there's this thriving alongside it of we won't let this stop us to be who we are.
Yeah. Okay, now we're gonna move to talk about, for those who you not know, Phoebe worked on the United Nations as consultant.
Yes.
So you could talk like a little, how was your experience working?
Okay.
Okay.
Interesting. All right. So my first job was with the UN, very first junior position, but also ended up later on as a consultant working on gender-based violence, which was really interesting, looking at conflict and non-conflict states, and perhaps this could be relatable with Brazil. I was working with an expert on guns or ammunition, or which is actually a war expert, and we were trying to, or what we did was to, or our terms of reference with the consultancy was to evaluate the UN policy on small arms, and small arms is guns, it's ammunition, in 9 sub-Saharan African countries with reference to gender-based violence. And of course this has various elements in it in relation to gender-based violence in women, one of them being femicide, the high levels of femicide, or women being killed by guns in the home, which is quite frightening. The other one is the trafficking of women that goes around with illicit weapons, especially in immediate post-war context, which was another dimension we looked at. And of course, within war context, the sexual violence that's rife. I'm sure you've heard about the DRC, where the Democratic Republic of Congo, where sexual violence has been used as a tool of war against women, but against men as well, actually. So we looked at 9 sub-Saharan African countries, and South Africa was the only non-war context, but could be seen as a war context due to the number of circulating illegal arms in the country. And I think Brazil is more or less the same. We're having a conversation with Fabi I think on Sunday, and he was telling me in one of the favelas in Porto Alegre that the number of deaths per person, is it per day or month or whatever, was the same as being in Damascus in Syria. Mm-hmm. Yeah? So, and yet Brazil is also a non-war context, right? But I mean, that's debatable on many fronts. So it was, I don't know, it was doing work on the ground and evaluating, domestic violence acts, and engaging with people who were, or NGOs and government officials who were addressing gender heads-on. Of course, there were, the different countries were at different levels, but there was some really exciting stuff that came up with certain countries that were doing great work. But the one thing, of course, that glaringly came out of that research was the disconnect between the policies and what's going on the ground. So most of these countries had beautiful domestic violence acts or policies in relation to violence against women, but the implementation was far from being. So indeed that questions this, what lies in between, and again, this disconnect that needs to be addressed. I guess I don't know what else to say.
So only light-hearted teams that you were working with.
Yes.
Well, also Phoebe's working here on an extension course here on La Salle University. Could you talk about your experience, how you enjoy the city, the university, the course? Did you have a great reception, support?
Well, this is my second time in Porto Alegre. Perhaps it's important to say that. I came in 2016 for a conference on levels of justice and social distance, which was organized by Fabiele, and spent a week here. It was intense, but worthwhile. And so this is my second time being back. So it wasn't completely strange and new, but this time it's different because I'm engaging in teaching a summer school course. And of course, yes, South Africa and Brazil are contextually similar. There are similarities you can draw on, and yes, I've been here before, so it's not completely new. But there were elements of anxiety as well because, I don't speak Portuguese, and I'm teaching a class that's not particularly within the field of sociology or culture studies, which is mostly what I'm used to teaching. So it's people who kind of have an idea of what I'm talking about. Whereas here it's law students, but international relations students who also, engage with some of these discussions. So and are quite clued in. It's been really great and interesting and a new experience, and I think I'm grateful to the kind of interpretation Fabi does. And yes, I do miss out on nuances of what's going on, but I think get the general idea of what's going on, and it's really been a fulfilling time for me being here, enriching time. Yes. And I hope it's the same for the students who are partaking.
I believe it's the same. Are you enjoying the food here?
Oh, hell yes.
I had to ask.
I had 2 barbecues over the weekend, and goodness knows why I didn't end up in a food coma. But really the best barbecues ever. And yesterday I've been craving a feijoada because I had it the last time I was here, and yesterday I managed to get a different one from the one I had the last time. But that has been great. And of course this time around tried
the mate?
Yes, which was also really interesting.
Yeah, it's okay if you didn't like it. You're not going to judge. You see any similarities? I guess you talked about, but something more concrete about this experience of Black people on Africa than the Black people here in Brazil.
Yeah. I guess the similarities are historical and historically rooted. What we've been talking about in class. I mean, both contexts. And of course this goes for the indigenous population of Brazil. Both contexts have experienced colonialism, and both contexts have experienced slavery. Well, the trajectory being the other way for the African continent. And indeed, the structural inequalities in both contexts have to be located, and these are the roots that place Black people in both contexts on the margins of society, or lack of access to these so-called rights in place, constitutional rights in place that only a few people get to enjoy. So yes, indeed, those are the similar contexts. So indeed, that's why we see favelas are very similar to South African townships on many levels, where indeed it's Black and colored communities in this context, and it's Black and colored communities that live in poverty and experience high levels of violence and are caught up in these structural dynamics.
Okay, we're now approaching the end of the video, so we're gonna just like super quick questions about your taste and the Oscars and and preference, just so to end like uplifting tone. Because we talk about like
it did
many subjects, and we're like, that's terrible. Why is it still happening today?
Yes.
Okay, let's start with coffee or tea.
Coffee in the morning, tea in the evening.
All right. You said that you love barbecue and you also taste feijoada. Which one did you like the best?
Oh, that's a hard choice. But I'll go for a barbecue because I don't get to have the kind of I don't get to have this kind of barbecue elsewhere. Yes.
The weather, did you like here?
The weather has been temperamental, but I'm used to temperamental. I lived in Europe for so many years, and I live in Cape Town actually, which gets quite temperamental. So it was a bit of a surprise, though. I didn't expect it to be this temperamental. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess global warming.
Yes.
Take it as like that.
Yes.
What about the Oscars? Like, did you watch it? Did you enjoy it?
Didn't watch it, but of course, it's my social media feeds were filled with that. But like I said yesterday in class, I was super pleased that Spike Lee finally got the recognition he deserves in this media, with his movie Black Klansman. Have you watched it?
I did. It was like, I think it was my favorite movie from last year.
Yeah.
I watched it this year, but it was alongside Black Panther, which I went to watch on when it started premiering, and I was like, I need to watch.
That's awesome. Yes, I remember I collected all of my friends in the Netherlands when it was in it was in winter, but we all tried to dress up, we all got out.
Yes, I was in Philadelphia, and when I went, everybody was like community up there, traditional dress, and I was like, oh my god, this is so cool.
I know. And we went in, so I lived in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and it's one of the most diverse city in the Netherlands. And there was this artsy cinema that was closed off specifically for a Black Panther, who was of course organized by the people of color community, and the tickets were sold out in a minute, so they had to book it and close it off for more shows to be shown. And yes, we had to dress up, so we all had to put on a lovely attires. It was absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I think I watched like 5 times already, but it's still great.
Yeah, indeed it is.
So, let's finish now. Thank you, Phoebe, for having this moment with us, for teaching us more about your experiences. We're really honored that you accept our invitation, because we're like, oh my god, what if she doesn't want to talk about it? And because we're like a small project right now, but really, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to engage in conversation with like-minded people who have social justice.
Okay.
So yeah, that's all. Obrigada, gente. A gente acabou.